Good morning, or at least good morning my time. It's the Thursday before I head out, and this is the Edward Bellamy lecture. Later today I will follow up with the other lecture that I need to do, the Emma Goldman, the anarchist lecture. The Edward Bellamy is a lecture that kind of gives me an excuse to talk about the influence of Marxist thought on the political movements of the late 19th and early part of the 20th century, and some of the motivations behind what becomes known as the progressive movement, and eventually the New Deal in the FDR administration. So, long story short, manufacturing that Hamilton wanted so much really started to take off, and along with that taking off were some of the unanticipated consequences of the manufacturing economy. In particular, the extreme inequalities that were emerging. And more people were becoming aware of these extreme inequalities. And Edward Bellamy wrote a novel that was a bestseller in 1888, 1889. It was at that point in time, it was the highest selling novel in America that had ever been written. Not a great novel. Haven't read the whole thing. That's how I guess it tells you that's not great. But for someone in the late 1880s, it may have spoken to some of their concerns at the time. The basic premise of the novel is that a guy from 1887 wakes up after having been to the year 2000 and tells people back in 1887 what it's like in the year 2000. So, I mean, we're obviously well beyond the year 2000, but it's utopian in its sort of uh, premises here because it paints a picture of the year 2000 where all the problems of the late 1800s have been resolved. And in particular, the problems of extreme inequality, what is referred to as the concentration of capital, concentration of wealth, that all members of society are treated with the same sort of concern. It's not like some are basically fodder for the elite few. So everything is kind of like, I don't know, a communist ideal. He doesn't use the word communist, but it is sort of what many people think of as the communist utopia, is sort of what Bellamy paints. The fact that this was such a popular book, such a bestseller, goes to show that there was a fair bit of public discontent in the economic situation of the late 1800s. And how this eventually plays out will be through the progressive era reforms and some of the changes that progressivism brings about, which will ultimately extend the influence of um, capitalism in the country. So let me get started by first introducing one of the key concepts that's brought up early on in this is on page 353 of our text. He says, uh, why the strikes, of course, I replied. This is on the left, 353. Exactly, but what made the strikes so formidable? The great labor organizations. And what was the motive of these great organizations? The workmen claimed they had to organize to get their rights from the big corporations, I replied. That is just it, said Dr. Leete. The organization of labor and the strikes were an effect merely of the concentration of capital in greater masses than had ever been known before. So this was, from a historical perspective, this was the time when labor unions were beginning to get started. And in fact, the Sherman Antitrust Act was first used against labor unions to protect the rights of the corporations. The argument was that the unions were interfering with the normal order of business in the same way that monopoly, when it's used against corporations, is claimed to be against the normal order of business. But ironically, it was first used against labor unions. But that was seen as a way in which, during this period, what's now known as the Gilded Age, the extreme concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, needed to be resisted. And one of the ways that it was initially resisted was through labor unions. And so, what Dr. Leet, the character in this novel, is saying is that the labor unions were merely an effect of and response to the reality, which was the concentration of capital. So let me say a little bit about Marx, because that was the sort of the background figure here that is sort of guiding the thought of Bellamy in this essay or this novel. So what Marx argues, and I teach this in the modern and contemporary political theory, we'll go through the economic and philosophic manuscripts. So if you were in that class, this will all be kind of redundant to you. This is just sort of a refresher of that for you. But the basic idea for Marx is that capital is basically abstract labor. It's the sort of quantitative value of labor at an abstract social level. So, in other words, you work for a corporation, you get paid a wage, and that wage then is basically kind of a marker of the value of the product you produced. And the ideal is to pay less and less of the percentage of the product you sell in wages. And through various means of technological improvement, cost cutting, etc., the percentage of the wage value of the product that's produced goes down, and the profits from the product produced go up. So the net result of this whole process, according to Marx, is that the value of wage gets less and less, whereas the profits from the products of wages go up and up. And who keeps the profits? The owners of the manufacturing industries and so on. So, in other words, you have the concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands. So, one of the examples that Marx claims is that this then leads to another competition. It leads to competition between capitalists themselves. And what Marx argues is that in this battle, the larger capitalists win out over the smaller capitalists, and so we have, even at that level, a kind of concentration of capital into fewer and fewer hands. So the poster child example of this process would have been like Walmart, where Walmart moves into a community. It moves right outside the actual kind of incorporated parts of the community, so it doesn't pay the city taxes and stuff. And then it comes in with a tremendous amount of capital on hand to really kind of stock all the cash registers and have lower prices, really have small profit margins. But because it's dealing in such size of what it's selling, it can take the small profit margin. Whereas the mom and pop stores, they can't handle that, so they end up going out of business. And all the people who would have gone to the mom and pop stores end up going to Walmart now. That's just an example of the kind of concentration of capital gets into fewer and fewer hands. And what Marx argued is that this process would get to the point where it was so top heavy, and so the division so egregious that it would eventually collapse. And then what Marx claims, that's where communism comes in. What that would look like and how that would take effect, that's not something that he said many details about, and that's probably for the better, because predictions don't often work out right. But Bellamy clearly had read his Marx, or had heard of Marx from others, because when he's talking about the concentration of capital, that is basically sort of the Marxist idea. And it definitely was, this was the Gilded Age, late 19th century, with all the trusts, and whether it was the oil trust of the Rockefellers, or the Carnegie Steel Trust, or the J.P. Morgan Chase financial trusts, they in effect had an unchallenged monopoly, and they could, through collusion and others, fix prices and maximize their profits, and increase the inequalities in society without check. And so in response to this was the rise of labor unions. And so this was actually a phenomenon that was beginning to happen in the late 19th century. The Pullman strikes later on, and various other sort of social unrest was beginning to happen. And so this is what's going on in the latter half of the 19th century. this is post-Civil War now, and so now we're dealing more with economic issues. Industrial capitalism has definitely kind of taken hold, and the effects of that were both positive in terms of the advances technologically and others that we see, but also it was uh, causing the social inequalities and many of the other issues that would eventually, some of which would come to be addressed through the progressive era reforms. And then again through some of the New Deal policies that would be implemented through FDR's time in office, many of which are now being questioned, and we can talk about that when we get to the end of the course as we start talking about conservative and progressive ideas in the more contemporary context of 2024 in terms of where we are now and what kinds of policies best reflect the sort of political philosophies that we have studied in this course in the American context. But in the context of America in the late 19th century, there definitely was a rising social unrest because of the gross inequalities in wealth and very visible gross inequalities. And one thing that I think is probably hard to understand today because of the way our culture is structured and the way people dress and just all sorts of other things is that we aren't as aware of some of these inequalities as people would have been back in the late 19th century. So, for instance, and I think this is perhaps a kind of a mundane example, it's not that mundane example, but the movie Titanic. If anyone has seen the movie, many of you probably have, the Leonardo DiCaprio, he's like a third class passenger on the Titanic, meaning he's basically from the working class. He's from the class that works in the factories and so on. And the fact that he even got on the Titanic is probably a luxury. But there was definitely a great disparity and a visible disparity in the way people dressed, etc., between the people and the poor and then the rich. Today, you see an Elon Musk, he dressed not much differently from the way anyone else dressed. If you saw him walking down the street, you wouldn't know that he was the richest person. And yet, that's despite that sort of visible lack of difference, there is probably more inequality in terms of wealth today than there was back in the late 19th century. But the social unrest is perhaps not the same. I don't know. I mean, that's something perhaps we could talk about. And if we were in class, I would stop here and we would talk about this kind of question. And perhaps when I get back next week, we can talk about this kind of question in terms of where we are today in social unrest, because I do think that Trump appeals to a lot of people who are not satisfied with where the country is, where the country's going, and want to shake things up. And Trump certainly appeals to that. So that's something we can talk about next week. But that would be ironic that it's been 140 years since, almost 140 years since Bellamy wrote this, 135 years. And are we still having similar issues that we were having 135 years ago? Again, things to think about. But the year 2000, at least, for Bellamy, at least in this novel that's written, all these problems get resolved. And the word that you would have to use to describe the utopian future that Bellamy describes in his novel is a socialist utopian state, where we no longer have the great inequalities, where everyone's in it together. And socialism was an emerging political movement, and even into the early 20th century, the Socialist Party would grab 20% of the vote. I mean, it was not a fringe party up for the first half of the 20th century. In fact, I voted early yesterday, and there is a socialist candidate for president. I didn't vote for that person, but I could have. They were on some woman, I can't remember her name, But yes, there was a socialist candidate along with 11 others candidates on the ballot, along with the main party candidates. But in the late 19th century, the people were looking for a political system that would work better than what was in place at the time, right? Because people saw the changes around them. They saw buildings popping up. They saw railroads. I mean, there were many benefits that were coming from increased technology, but there was also um, great poverty emerging at the same time. In fact, a contemporary of Bellamy's wrote another book that was also extremely popular called Progress and Poverty. And the question was, how can we have such visible and obvious progress, right? From if you look at the beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, which is when Bellamy and Henry George was writing his book, the visible progress was there for everyone to see. If you look at the beginning of the century, people were basically not living lives much different from what they had been living 1,000 years before, right? In terms of technology, some differences in terms of shipping and stuff like that. But by the end of the 19th century, the steam engine, with terms of trains, steel, skyscrapers, trains, steamboats, all forms of transportation were coming online, which would only accelerate in the 20th century with airplanes and computers and mass communication. So the end of the 19th century was seeing the type of progress that would take off and continue into the 20th and 21st centuries. But at the same time, alongside this progress, many people were seeing more and more signs of poverty, people living in squalor in cities, inner cities, often working many hours a day at factories under dangerous conditions, and coming home and just having enough to survive, but really just not doing well. So you had this sort of slums and squalor in inner cities. And then you had the people who owned the factories, the large capitalists, and they were extremely wealthy. And so the question is, why are we having, why, if there's so much wealth out there, why is it being distributed in such an unequal way? So the question then is, how can we address this? How can we resolve this inequality of distribution that was becoming more and more evident? And one of the approaches was a more socialist, where all the wealth should be distributed fairly among society as a whole. And that's sort of the approach that Bellamy calls for. And he calls it the Great Trust. And so let me read what he says here on page 354. He says, early in the last century, the evolution was complete. So this is like early 1900s, right? He's talking about early in the last century, evolution was completed by the final consolidation of the entire capital of the nation. The industry and commerce of the country, ceasing to be conducted by a set of irresponsible corporations and syndicates of private persons at their caprice and for their profit, were entrusted to a single syndicate representing the people, to be conducted in the common interest for the common profit. The nation, that is to say, organized as the one great business corporation in which all other corporations were absorbed, it became the one capitalist in the place of all other capitalists, the sole employer, the final monopoly in which all previous and lesser monopolies were swallowed up, a monopoly in the profits and economies of which all citizens shared. The epoch of trust had ended in the Great Trust. So, again, 1887, what he's describing here as this sort of utopian future is the steel trust, the bank trust, the oil trust, all gets absorbed by this great trust, which doesn't see to the interest of the few capitalists that own these trusts, the private interests, to their caprice and to their profit, but ultimately to the people as a whole, to their benefit. And so the idea then is that the monopoly is now a monopoly for the benefit of all people. This becomes Lenin's understanding of the Communist Party when he takes the same sort of popular social unrest with the inequality in Russia, especially with the class system and the monarchical system that they had there, um, that he, as a party, claims that his party will represent the people. It will be the monopoly. And so you have state-owned corporations, state-owned industry. So you do end up in a kind of great trust with the communist system in Russia. And to some extent, we can see that as a kind of cautionary tale, that didn't work out that well for them, because there is something about the sort of the market system that is more adaptive and more nimble with respect to responding to changes and distributing talents and resources in ways that are more effective as circumstances change, whereas centrally controlled economies tend to not be as effective. And that's probably one of the main reasons, as many people will see, and we'll talk about this as the semester kind of continues on. One of the main reasons people cite as to why both China and the Soviet Union kind of broke apart, or at least broke away from their centralized economic planning to a more accommodating economy that allowed for market forces to enter. So Russia's definitely that way, and China as well. It's like a two system. It has both, the kind of allows for market forces, but it also still has the kind of autocratic state system that can step in and have some centralized planning, but it has not attempted to resist the market forces. Um, so that's something to think about. That in the 1800s, though, this was still thought of as one option, as a way of avoiding the great inequalities that many people were seeing at that time. So again, remember, in the late 1800s, people were looking around for an alternative to the way things were at that time. And socialism and anarchism, which we'll talk about in the next lecture with Emma Goldman, was another one of the alternatives. Communism was one that came about, and it was actually one through line that actually became implemented. But what ends up happening in our country, at least, is that we end up seeing the progressive reforms coming in as a way of addressing the worst effects of industrial capitalism. Antitrust legislation, regulatory agencies to make sure things are safe, worker safety. And then with the New Deal, we have Medicare, Medicaid, some of the social safety nets. So some of these concerns begin to get addressed by these types of policies. And most corporations were actually on the side of it, because they were worried about a kind of takeover of their businesses by populist uprising, kind of like what you saw in the Soviet Union. So that becomes one of the ways in which it gets addressed. And there's some interesting literature out there and books as to the differing responses to the Great Depression, for instance, how the stock market crash of 1929 was interpreted by different people and groups in different countries around the world, and how, given the institutions in those countries, they were able to respond to it. So, for instance, the Scandinavian countries had a different set of institutions in place, so they end up with a much more kind of progressive and proactive approach. The English-speaking world, in particular the UK and the United States, had more, might call it conservative institutions in place. So even though we might think of the FDR approach as being fairly liberal by today's standards, it was, in the context of the time, more conservative than what the Scandinavian countries were doing. It certainly wasn't socialist. It was still allowing for free markets and private ownership of corporations and so on. But it did at least call for policies that protected the bottom half of society, or the bottom three-quarters of society. One of the last things I want to talk about in the Bellamy